My name is Melany Vance. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 3 years, I've been the invisible backbone of my family, a software engineer quietly paying off my parents' mortgage and property taxes while living in a cramped apartment. They were hosting their 30th wedding anniversary dinner at a five-star steakhouse downtown tonight, an event I'd been looking forward to for months, but when I called to ask about the dress code, my mother's voice was cold. She told me there was a seating mistake at the restaurant, and the guest list was strictly limited, so they had to cut me out to make room for more important relatives. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, telling myself it was just a dinner, until I opened Instagram 2 hours later. My sister had posted a photo of the entire family laughing under crystal chandeliers with a caption that felt like a knife to my chest: family only. Finally, the whole crew is together. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Instead, I felt a freezing clarity wash over me. I typed a single comment under that photo: huge, congrats. Since I'm clearly not family, the mortgage and property taxes are all yours starting tomorrow. Enjoy the house. I hit send and watched the screen. 5 minutes later, the post was scrubbed from the internet. Within 10 minutes, 33 missed calls from my father and sister lit up my phone like a firework display. I didn't answer a single one. I just sat in the dark, realizing they hadn't forgotten me. They had used me until they thought I was no longer necessary. If you've ever been treated like a financial safety net instead of a human being by the people who were supposed to love you, stay with me. What I did next didn't just ruin their party, it dismantled the lies they'd been living for years. After you hear how I took my life back, tell me in the comments, would you have stayed silent, or would you have burned the bridge like I did? The silence in my apartment felt heavy as I stared at the ceiling, my mind drifting back to the decade of double shifts and exhausted sighs that led me to this moment of betrayal. Growing up in the Vance household meant learning early on that love was a resource, and in our house, that resource was strictly reserved for Caitlin. My younger sister was the golden child, the one whose every whim was treated like a royal decree, while I was merely the structural support keeping the roof over their heads. When I turned 18, there was no celebratory dinner or college fund waiting for me. Instead, my mother, Deborah Vance, sat me down at the scarred oak kitchen table and handed me a stack of brochures for local community colleges. She told me that while they wanted the best for me, the family's finances were tight, and I would need to find a way to fund my own path. I spent the next 4 years working 40 hours a week at a greasy diner while carrying a full course load in software engineering, coming home with aching feet only to see a brand new silver sedan sitting in the driveway. My father, Gregory Vance, had beamed with pride as he handed the keys to 17-year-old Caitlin, explaining that she needed a reliable vehicle for her social life and cheerleading practice. They used the money I had been told didn't exist, the money I had hoped might help with my tuition, to buy my sister's affection, while I struggled to pay for textbooks. That pattern of parasitic reliance only deepened after I landed my first high-paying job in Silicon Valley. 3 years ago, Gregory called me in a state of orchestrated panic, his voice trembling as he described a series of bad investments and the looming threat of losing the family home. He didn't ask for a loan, he asked for a miracle. Being the good daughter who had been conditioned to seek their approval through service, I stepped in without hesitation. I restructured their debt, set up an automatic transfer from my savings, and began paying $3,500 every single month to cover their mortgage and property taxes. I lived in a studio apartment with a leaky faucet and drove a 10-year-old car so that they could maintain the illusion of a comfortable middle-class life in their suburban colonial. For over 36 months, I functioned as their anonymous benefactor, never once receiving a thank you note or a phone call that didn't involve a request for more cash. Deborah would often brag on Facebook about her beautiful home and the blessings of their hard work, intentionally omitting the fact that her eldest daughter's bank account was the only thing standing between them and a foreclosure sign. I became a ghost in my own family, a ghost with a credit card. Every time I visited for the holidays, I was treated like an intruder in the house I was literally purchasing for them. Caitlin would lounge on the expensive sofa I had replaced, complaining about the slow Wi-Fi while showing off her latest designer handbags, gifts from our parents that were undoubtedly funded by the money I saved them on bills. I watched as they curated a life of luxury built on the foundation of my exhaustion, feeling the cold weight of isolation settle into my bones. I was the safety net they only acknowledged when they felt themselves falling the invisible engine driving a vehicle I wasn't allowed to ride in. The realization that I was being systematically bled dry of both my finances and my spirit was a slow, agonizing burn, but I kept my head down, foolishly believing that one day my sacrifice would finally make me worthy of being called family in their eyes. The flickering light of my laptop screen was the only company I had as I began to dissect the digital paper trail my father had carefully woven over the years. Gregory Vance was not a loud man. He didn't need to shout to exert control, as his primary weapon had always been a calculated professional silence that masked a deep-seated greed. As a retired accountant, he possessed a meticulous mind for numbers, a skill he had unfortunately turned against his own flesh and blood to ensure his and Caitlin's comfort. For years, I had allowed him to maintain access to my older bank accounts and primary email addresses under the guise of managing the transition after I moved away from my career. He convinced me that it was safer for a financial professional like him to monitor my credit score and handle the mundane paperwork of my student loans, while I focused on my demanding role as a software engineer. I had viewed this as a gesture of fatherly protection, a way for him to remain involved in my life, despite the physical distance between us. But the reality was far more sinister. He was the gatekeeper of my financial identity, a man who used his expertise to curate a reality where I was perpetually indebted to the family's needs, while he steered my hard-earned money toward my sister's extravagant lifestyle. Every few weeks, like clockwork, my phone would buzz with a message that followed a hauntingly predictable pattern of emotional extortion. The texts always began with a phrase designed to bypass my defenses, something like, "The family needs your strength, Melany," or, "Your mother is quite distressed about the upcoming property tax assessment." Gregory never asked for a specific favor. He framed every financial demand as a communal crisis that only I had the power to resolve. He would weave tales of unexpected medical bills for Deborah or urgent repairs for the house, always concluding the message with a precise, non-negotiable dollar amount. One week it was $2,400 for a fictitious roof leak, and the next it was $1,800 for an insurance premium that I later discovered didn't even exist. He played on my desire to be the protector, the one person who could keep the Vance name from falling into ruin, all while he quietly diverted those funds into Caitlin's influencer business ventures. His silence during our family dinners wasn't out of modesty but a strategic avoidance. He knew that if he spoke too much, the mask of the struggling retiree might slip and reveal the man who was systematically bleeding his eldest daughter dry. As I dug deeper into my records that night, I realized how thoroughly he had exploited my trust by keeping my old credentials active. He had set up a complex system of forwarding filters on my legacy email account, ensuring that any alerts regarding new credit inquiries or significant withdrawals were redirected to his private inbox before I could ever see them. This was how they managed to keep me in the dark about the true state of their finances, while I blindly funneled thousands of dollars into their accounts every month. I found logs of him logging into my investment portal in the middle of the night, shifting small amounts of capital that he thought I wouldn't miss, treating my future like a personal slush fund for his favorite child. The betrayal stung more because it was so clinical, so devoid of the messy emotions my mother usually employed. Gregory Vance didn't just take my money, he used his professional life's work to turn his daughter into a high-yield asset. He watched me struggle through 60-hour work weeks from the comfort of the armchair I had paid for sipping tea, and nodding in silent approval as long as the transfers remained on schedule. The realization that my father saw me as nothing more than a ledger entry was the final crack in the foundation of my loyalty. The neon sign of the 24-hour diner flickered intermittently, casting a rhythmic blue glow over the steam rising from my untouched black coffee. I had arranged to meet Jordan Miller, a sharp-witted attorney, and one of the few people who knew the true extent of my family's financial entanglement, just an hour after the digital dust had settled on my social media comment. Jordan sat across from me, his expression a mixture of professional concern and personal frustration as he watched me aimlessly stir the dark liquid in my cup. He didn't offer empty platitudes or tell me that things would eventually work themselves out with a simple conversation. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low and steady against the backdrop of the late-night city hum. He pointed out the sheer recklessness of allowing Gregory to maintain any semblance of control over my credit identity, especially given my father's history of prioritizing Caitlin's whims over my basic security. Jordan explained that in the eyes of the law, a family bond was not a legal shield against identity theft or financial exploitation, and that my Good Daughter Act was effectively providing the Vance household with a blank check signed in my blood. He challenged me to look beyond the guilt that Deborah had spent decades perfecting, and to see the situation for what it actually was, a systematic draining of my future prospects to fund a present that my parents had no right to afford. The gravity of his words began to sink in as I pulled out my tablet, my hands trembling slightly as I navigated through the labyrinth of my secondary credit reports that Gregory had supposedly been monitoring for me. Jordan guided me through the various sections, his finger tapping on the screen whenever a discrepancy appeared. His legal training spotting red flags that I had previously dismissed as mere clerical errors. We found several credit inquiries from luxury car dealerships and high-end furniture stores that I had never visited, let alone authorized to pull my data. Even more disturbing were the tiny, recurring payments to a digital marketing firm I'd never heard of, which Jordan suspected was the engine behind Caitlin's fabricated social media popularity. He warned me that if these people were willing to use my name for minor luxuries, there was no telling what they would do when the stakes were raised, or when they felt their lifestyle was being threatened. The betrayal felt less like a sudden blow and more like a slow-acting poison that had been coursing through my veins for years unnoticed until the moment I decided to stop being the antidote to their self-inflicted problems. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the sheer volume of unusual activity on my accounts was staggering. I discovered that my billing address for several major credit cards had been changed to the family home 6 months ago, ensuring that the physical statements would never reach my actual apartment. Jordan watched in silence as I logged into my primary retirement fund, only to find that a significant portion of my diversified assets had been liquidated and moved into a high-risk joint account that I didn't recognize. The professional accountant in my father had calculated exactly how much he could shave off the top without triggering an immediate fraud alert, counting on my exhaustion and misplaced trust to keep me from ever looking too closely. Each line item was a testament to their lack of respect for my labor, a clear indication that to Deborah, Gregory, and Caitlin, I was not a person with dreams and needs, but a resource to be managed and eventually discarded. I felt a cold, hard resolve begin to form in the pit of my stomach, a sharp departure from the desperate need for approval that had defined my life until this morning. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was becoming a strategist, realizing that if I was going to survive the fallout of my public declaration, I had to move faster and be more ruthless than the people who had raised me. A heavy courier box sat on my doorstep 2 days later, the stark return to sender stamp, mocking my final desperate attempt at domestic diplomacy. Inside was the luxury Swiss timepiece I had purchased for my parents' anniversary, a $3,000 gesture of goodwill that I hoped might bridge the growing chasm between us. I had included a handwritten note expressing my desire for a clean slate, yet Deborah Vance had not even bothered to unwrap the protective plastic before shipping it back. Taped to the lid was a single sheet of lined paper with her sharp, aggressive cursive stating that they didn't need my guilt-ridden charity, or the condescending pity, of a daughter who chose to embarrass them on the internet. It was a cold, calculated rejection that signaled their refusal to acknowledge the financial reality I had sustained for years, choosing instead to double down on their indignation. I realized then that my mother viewed my financial support not as a sacrifice to be honored, but as a mandatory tribute that didn't buy me a seat at her table. The watch sat on my kitchen counter, its steady ticking a reminder that my time as the family's silent benefactor was rapidly running out, and that no amount of expensive gold or precision engineering could fix a relationship built on exploitation. While the sting of the returned gift was still fresh, I stumbled upon a different kind of betrayal while scrolling through a local online marketplace to clear my head. A series of listings caught my eye, featuring several of my high-end electronics and designer coats that I had left in the guest room of the family home for safekeeping. Caitlin had photographed my belongings against her messy bedroom floor, offering them at bargain prices to fund what she described in the comments as her summer lifestyle upgrade. She was selling my hard-earned property items I had bought with my first major bonuses to pay for music festival tickets and luxury skincare kits. When I messaged her from a burner account to ask if the items were still available, she boasted about having a constant supply of vintage gear from her rich, absent sister. The sheer audacity of her entitlement made my blood run cold as I watched her liquidate my past to finance her shallow present. It wasn't just about the money or the objects. It was the realization that in the Vance household, anything that belonged to me was considered community property, while anything they owned was strictly off-limits. They were stripping my life for parts, while I was still trying to save theirs, treating my identity like an abandoned warehouse they could loot at will. The combination of my mother's prideful rejection and my sister's casual theft provided the clarity I needed to stop playing the victim and start playing the strategist. I logged into my primary checking account and performed a task that felt both terrifying and liberating. I canceled the recurring $3,500 wire transfer scheduled for the first of the month. For the first time in over 3 years, I was going to let the mortgage and property tax deadline pass, without my intervention, curious to see how long their family-only facade would last once the foundation of my cash disappeared. I knew the bank would send a courtesy notification to Gregory's email, and I waited with a grim sense of anticipation for the inevitable explosion of outrage. This wasn't an act of revenge yet. It was a stress test to see if they truly believed they could survive without the person they had so eagerly discarded. I spent the evening drafting a formal letter of intent to the bank, notifying them that I was no longer an authorized payer for the Vance account, effectively cutting the umbilical cord of credit that had kept their lifestyle afloat. As I hit the confirm button on the cancellation, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was no longer the invisible pillar holding up a house of cards. I was the wind that was about to blow it all down, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel a single ounce of guilt for choosing myself over their comfort. The vibrating hum of my phone against the wooden desk at 3 p.m. wasn't a frantic call from Gregory or a vitriolic text from Deborah, but a professional greeting from a senior loan officer at a major regional bank. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Sarah Miller, was calling to congratulate me on the final approval of my personal equity loan for $15,000, a sum that had apparently been requested to cover urgent home renovations and family stabilization. I sat in stunned silence, my heart hammering against my ribs as I listened to her go over the repayment terms and the interest rates that were now legally tied to my social security number. I had never stepped foot in that branch, nor had I ever expressed interest in borrowing against my future to fix a house I was already paying for. When I managed to find my voice, I asked Sarah to send over the digital application and the signature verification documents, immediately claiming I needed them for my tax records, while my mind raced through the terrifying implications of what this meant. The realization that my silence and financial support hadn't been enough to satisfy their greed was a bitter pill to swallow. But the technical reality of how they achieved this was far more devastating. The email arrived 10 minutes later, and as I opened the attached PDF, I felt a wave of cold nausea wash over me that no amount of coffee could settle. There at the bottom of the multi-page agreement was a perfect digital replica of my signature, authenticated through a secure portal that Melany Vance had access to because I had trusted him with my legacy credentials. My father, the retired accountant who had spent his career teaching people the importance of financial integrity, had used his intimate knowledge of my digital footprint to commit identity theft against his own daughter. He hadn't just asked for money this time. He had stolen my consent, forging my name to a legal document that could ruin my credit score for a decade if anything went wrong. The application listed Deborah as the secondary contact and Caitlin as a dependent resident, painting a picture of a unified family unit that was being held together by the very person they had intentionally excluded from their anniversary celebration. They had used the precise window of time during their party preparations to finalize the fraud, banking on the fact that I would be too distracted by my own exclusion to notice the credit alerts they had successfully diverted. The pain of being uninvited to a dinner was a paper cut compared to the jagged wound of this institutional betrayal, as I realized my parents viewed my life as nothing more than a series of assets to be liquidated. I spent the next 4 hours on the phone with Jordan Miller, my lawyer, and the bank's fraud department, systematically deconstructing the lie that Gregory had built. We discovered that this $15,000 loan was just the beginning. There were drafts for a much larger refinancing package totaling over $200,000 sitting in my father's pending folder, waiting for me to be too tired or too busy to check the notifications. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking, a calculated effort to bind me to their suburban lifestyle indefinitely through a web of fraudulent debt. Every "I love you" and every holiday card I had ever received from them felt like a calculated distraction, a way to keep the host animal calm while the parasites continued to feed. I wasn't just a daughter to them. I was a financial instrument to be played until the strings snapped, a resource they intended to exhaust, until there was nothing left but a hollowed-out credit report and a lifetime of resentment. As the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across my apartment, the last remnants of my familial loyalty finally evaporated into a hard, crystalline resolve. I no longer cared about saving face or maintaining the illusion of a functional family for the sake of Deborah's social standing or Caitlin's online persona. I authorized Jordan to file an official police report for identity theft and a formal dispute with the credit bureaus, knowing that this path would lead to an irreversible confrontation and potential criminal charges for Gregory. The good daughter, who had spent years seeking a seat at a table that was never hers, died in that moment, replaced by a woman who understood that peace without justice was just a polite form of surrender. I felt a strange, cold peace descend over me as I watched the digital files being uploaded to the authorities, knowing that the next time I spoke to my family, it wouldn't be as a daughter begging for a scrap of affection. I was now a victim of a crime, and they were the perpetrators, and no amount of emotional manipulation or blood relation could change the cold, hard facts of the documents sitting on my screen. The sun-drenched patio of the local bistro seemed far too cheerful for the atmospheric tension radiating from the circular table where my family sat waiting for me. Deborah Vance had already ordered mimosas, her face set in a mask of practiced disappointment while Gregory remained hidden behind the Sunday paper, a tactical move to avoid early eye contact. Caitlin was busy adjusting the lighting on her phone for a selfie, appearing completely oblivious to the financial ruin she was actively participating in. I walked toward them with a heavy manila folder tucked under my arm, the weight of the documents inside feeling like a loaded weapon. As I pulled out a chair, the air immediately chilled, and my mother didn't even wait for me to sit down before she began her planned lecture on the sanctity of family obligations. She spoke about the disruption I had caused by canceling the mortgage payment, describing my actions as a betrayal of the blood that bound us together. She demanded an apology for my public comment, insisting that I had humiliated them in front of the entire community over a simple seating misunderstanding. Gregory finally lowered his paper, nodding in agreement, his silence finally breaking to remind me that he had managed my affairs out of love, and that my sudden independence was a slap in the face to his years of guidance. I waited for the silence to follow their coordinated assault, feeling a strange sense of detachment as I looked at the three people who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset. When Deborah paused to take a sip of her drink, I calmly placed the folder in the center of the table, sliding it past the expensive appetizers I was no longer willing to pay for. I told them that the era of my silent compliance was over and that I had spent the last 48 hours discovering exactly what guidance looked like in my father's professional vocabulary. Gregory's face paled as I flipped open the folder to reveal the forged digital signature on the $15,000 loan application, the ink on the printed PDF looking stark and unforgiving in the morning light. I watched the recognition hit him, followed quickly by a desperate attempt to frame his crime as a necessary family maneuver to keep their lifestyle from collapsing. Caitlin reached for the papers, but I pulled them back, telling her that these weren't props for her social media feed, but legal evidence of a felony committed against her own sister. The facade of the perfect Vance family shattered in an instant, replaced by the ugly, raw panic of people who had finally been caught in their own web. Deborah tried to pivot back to emotional manipulation, claiming that a good daughter wouldn't care about a few technicalities if it meant her parents stayed in their home. She accused me of being cold and calculating, suggesting that my career in software had turned my heart into a machine that couldn't understand the nuances of family sacrifice. I looked her directly in the eye, seeing the woman who had cropped me out of her life both literally and figuratively, and felt nothing but a profound sense of relief. I told her that she was right about one thing. I had finally learned the value of my own worth, and that value was no longer up for negotiation. I explained that I had already filed a formal dispute with the bank, and that the police report for identity theft was sitting on a detective's desk at this very moment. The table went dead quiet as the reality of criminal consequences began to settle over them, the clinking of silverware from neighboring tables providing a surreal soundtrack to their downfall. Gregory tried to stammer out an excuse about repaying it eventually. But his accountant's mind knew that the paper trail was too clean, and my resolve was too hard for any more lies to bridge the gap. As I stood up to leave, I leaned in close to my mother, making sure every word carried the weight of the last 10 years of my life. I told her that she had wanted an intimate, family-only celebration, and now she was going to get exactly that, a small broken circle of people who had nothing left but their shared greed and the looming shadow of a foreclosure sign. I looked at the empty seat they had forced me into today, a seat I was now vacating of my own free will. I told her, "Mom, you made it very clear that I wasn't part of your inner circle when you posted that photo. You wanted me to be a ghost, so that's exactly what I'm going to be. I am not just a stranger in your photo anymore. From this day forward, I am a stranger in your debt." I walked away without looking back, leaving the folder of forgeries and the unpaid brunch bill on the table. The sound of Caitlin's sudden shrill protest and Gregory's heavy silence faded as I reached the sidewalk, the cool San Francisco breeze feeling like the first breath of air I had taken in years. I was finally free of the Vance mortgage, the Vance taxes, and most importantly, the Vance lies. The dust finally settled 6 months after I walked away from that brunch table, leaving behind a trail of legal fire that consumed the carefully constructed illusions of the Vance family. Without my monthly infusion of $3,500, the precarious house of cards Gregory and Deborah had built collapsed with terrifying speed. The bank, having received my formal notification of non-payment and the subsequent fraud reports filed by Jordan Miller, initiated foreclosure proceedings on the suburban Colonial within 90 days. I watched from a distance through cold legal notices as the home I had spent years protecting was plastered with orange stickers and eventually sold at a public auction to satisfy the outstanding debts. My father's credit score, once his most prized professional asset, plummeted into the low 300s, a catastrophic figure that ensured he would never qualify for so much as a store credit card for the remainder of his life. He was forced to move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a less than desirable neighborhood, his reputation as a financial expert shattered among the peers who now knew the truth about his identity theft. Caitlin's downfall was perhaps the most public and poetic, as the very digital world she used to exclude me became the instrument of her social undoing. When the police report became a matter of public record, the story of the influencer who lived off her sister's stolen credit spread through her follower base like a virus. The brands that had once sent her free products for promotion quickly issued statements of dissociation, citing their commitment to ethical standards, as they canceled her contracts. Her former friends, the same people who had laughed in the anniversary photo I was cropped out of, vanished the moment the luxury lifestyle vanished, leaving her with thousands of dollars in unpaid credit card debt and a social media presence that was now a graveyard of negative comments. She tried to play the victim one last time, posting a tearful video about family misunderstandings. But the internet had already seen the receipts. She was forced to take a job working retail at a local mall, just to cover her basic expenses, a reality that felt like a prison sentence to someone who had never known the weight of honest labor. Deborah Vance found herself in a social exile that was far more painful than the financial loss she endured. The woman who once bragged about her perfect blessings now avoided the grocery store to escape the pitying whispers of neighbors who had watched the movers carry her belongings out to the curb. She sent me dozens of emails during those first few months, ranging from vitriolic accusations of being an ungrateful child to desperate pleas for a few $1,000s to get back on her feet. I never replied to a single one. I didn't block her. I simply let the messages pile up in a folder I never opened, treating them as artifacts of a life I no longer inhabited. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apology that could bridge the canyon of betrayal they had carved between us. I understood that some bridges are meant to be burned, so that the person crossing them can never be tempted to return to the fire. I eventually relocated to a quiet, sun-filled apartment in a different city, a place where no one knew the name Melany Vance as anything other than the quiet woman who enjoyed her coffee on the balcony. My new home was small, but every square inch of it was paid for with my own money and registered in my own name, protected by security measures that Gregory could never bypass. I spent my evenings in a silence that was no longer heavy with expectation or guilt, but light with the realization of my own autonomy. The 3-year debt I had carried was gone, replaced by a healthy savings account and a sense of self-worth that no longer required their validation. I learned that peace was the most expensive thing I had ever bought, and it was worth every cent of the $200,000 they had tried to steal from me. As I sat by my window watching the sunset, I realized that for the first time in 31 years, I wasn't waiting for a seat at someone else's table. I had built my own, and there was only one seat reserved strictly for the woman who had finally learned how to be her own family.